At the height of his powers, Pablo Escobar was raking in $149.5 million every single day. In today's money, at least, that's $55.5 billion a year. As the famous anecdote goes, his cartel was going through $1,000 a week in rubber bands that went around the wads of cash. Escobar owned exquisite mansions, a fleet of luxury cars, and even a personal zoo featuring giraffes and hippos. But to get all those things, like any law-breaking drug trafficker, he had to get his vast amount of mostly American money cleaned. As you'll see today, this is sometimes quite a complex operation and involves a lot of law-abiding friends. Let's stick with the deceased Mr. Escobar before we talk about the present state of money laundering for today's super-rich, technology-savvy criminals. We guess we should first explain a little bit about what money laundering actually is, for those of you unacquainted with the high crime. Basically, if you were a criminal earning millions of bucks from your highly illegal enterprise, you want to spend that money without someone asking questions. This is when money laundering comes in. Even smaller drug dealers these days will have a small front business, say a burger restaurant, so it'll look like they earn cash from a legitimate trade. All you have to do is do things that are inflating the prices so it looks like you've earned a legitimate profit. That's the real basic kind of money laundering. But when you're big, you need someone to wash your dirty cash in a complex system. Hence the term laundering. You can't keep all that cash under your bed, and if you want to put it in the bank, you need to make it look as though it was earned through legal enterprise. You first get the money, then you can layer it by doing lots of small global transactions, perhaps buying stocks, or by using a shell company. After that, you integrate the money, meaning the money earned has come back to you to buy things with, but now it looks as if you earned the cash through legal means. Back in the day, the Colombian cartels didn't always use complex schemes. Those were the early days when law enforcement was lax and just about anyone could be bribed. In those days, the cartels would sometimes simply buy gold from Italy. They bought so much that they almost destabilized the price of gold there. The gold would then be smuggled back to Colombia, with some bribes on the way, no doubt. Then the cartels would sell the stuff to create legitimate money. Sometimes they simply sold it to Panama, but other times they smelted it and sold it to town mayors in Colombia. Those mayors then sold it to the state, saying that it came from local mines. Many years after Pablo Escobar met his end on a hot tin roof, the Sinaloa cartel would buy gold in the USA. They'd then sell it in the US, where someone would melt it down and sell it for hard cash. In this case, the melting guys in Florida would keep 1% of the earnings, which was still a lot. Sure, it meant falsifying lots of paperwork, but it worked. Well, it did until it didn't. Gold is great for traffickers. In 2020, there were reports that one company based in Dubai was buying large amounts of gold from traffickers, and then that company was selling the gold to large US companies that used the precious substance for certain components and goods. So if you've ever used a product made by Apple, General Motors, or Amazon, and it has gold bits in it, you might have unwittingly helped those cartels. The company in Dubai denied doing it, but the DEA said it transferred tremendous amounts of illicit value through the use of gold as a commodity. The New York Times wrote about a vicious cycle that's been going on for years. The cycle goes drugs, gold, money, drugs, gold, money, and so on. The United States attorney then said that getting the drugs into the US was actually easier than getting the money out. You should know that when a large sum of money appears in a bank account, it can set off alarm bells. There was a guy in the UK who made a ton of cash from investing in virtual currencies, and then one day he found out that his account had been closed due to a flag of suspicious activity. He almost had a heart attack, but the bank hadn't taken the money. They gave him a check, and in the end he just had to go do his banking elsewhere. The tide of drugs and drug money never ends. It might get slightly interrupted, but the drug war is possibly the best example of Sisyphus pushing that ball of rock up a hill for an eternity. That's why drug traffickers have to keep evolving their laundering schemes, just as the man you know as El Chapo did. While El Chapo was in his prime, he used an ingenious method to fly under the radar. A man named Hernan Botero Moreno came up with the idea of depositing less than $10,000 at a time and got the name Papa Smurf, hence the term smurfing. He'd get what has been described as an army of smurfs to deposit drug money in banks, but to avoid the bank issuing a suspicious activity report, the amount of cash was always under $10,000. Cute. But even with an army of people, it's not really that effective when you're talking about millions upon millions of dollars. El Chapo had many other tricks up his sleeves too. He'd do what's called trade-based money laundering, meaning he'd simply buy goods from companies with his drug money and sell the goods in Mexico for pesos. We're talking about a lot of goods. This can mean a company will knowingly take illicit cash, or if they're unaware that they're dealing with extremely dodgy people. What the authorities will be doing meanwhile is looking for companies that have suddenly started selling way more than they did previously, or perhaps companies that have historically used money transfers but then suddenly changed to using large sums of cash instead. Let's give you a real example. El Chapo for a while was buying large amounts of clothes in LA's fashion district, and some of those sellers were not reporting their transactions. This went on for a while, with El Chapo selling the clothes in Mexico. It only came undone because US banks started becoming suspicious when they saw the accounts of some of those sellers. But wouldn't you do the same given the opportunity? A cartel buying your goods in bulk can be a really good way of making money. So while this is a lot easier than you might have thought, the Cali and Medellin cartels used to do something even simpler. They used check cashing stores in New York City to get the money back to Colombia. And while you might think it wasn't that efficient, they sent $800 million back through this scheme before it was exposed. Banks can help too. When the cartel started making ridiculous amounts of money, they started putting it in banks in Miami, which led to alarm sounding after a while. The Federal Reserve Bank in Florida had a $5.5 billion cash surplus when all over the country there was a cash deficit. It turned out the banks involved were taking massive lump sums of cash and asking for very little documentation. They were found out through something called Operation Greenback. But don't go thinking that just because banks had been busted in the past, other banks didn't take huge amounts of cartel cash later. In 2006, a DC-9 jet landed down in Mexico where there was a bunch of soldiers waiting for it. When they checked the contents of the plane, they found around $100 million of cocaine. That was hardly a big deal. What was a big deal, though, was the evidence in the plane that showed the Sinaloa cartel had been laundering billions of bucks through a U.S. bank. That bank was the Wachovia Bank, which would later become part of Wells Fargo. No one at the bank ever went to prison for the crime, although forfeiture and a fine in 2010 meant that the bank had to give the authorities a total of $160 million. That wasn't much, actually only 2% of the $12.3 billion the bank made in 2009. It's not as if the bank was friends with the cartels, or at least we don't think that was the case, but as the US media said, it showed a blatant disregard for our banking laws. The money was just too good. Here's what The Guardian had to say about this. More shocking, and more importantly, the bank was sanctioned for failing to apply the proper anti-laundering strictures to the transfer of $378.4 billion, a sum equivalent to one-third of Mexico's gross national product, into dollar accounts from so-called Casas de Cambio, CDCs in Mexico, currency exchange houses with which the bank did business. In this case, an English bloke working at the bank, Martin Woods, had spotted the suspicious accounts, but when he told his superiors something sketchy was happening, he got in trouble. He later took the bank to court and won a settlement for the unfair dismissal. He said of the bank's dealings with the cartels, "These are the proceeds of murder and misery in Mexico and of drugs sold around the world, but no one goes to jail." And don't go thinking other banks didn't do it. With relatively small penalties and massive profits to make, you'd be a fool not to get involved. That usually just means turning a billion blind eyes. In fact, banks have been called the financial wing of the cartels. They're almost silent partners. In the words of Bob Dylan, steal a little, they throw you in jail. Steal a lot, and they make you a king. Ask the British investment bank HSBC, which not that long ago was down on its knees saying, sorry guys, sorry, bad form, old chap." That's because it was doing business with the largest drug cartel in the world, and the bosses, it seemed, had given the accounts the blind eye treatment. It was obvious that was cartel money, that's for sure. This was Wachovia Part 2, a bank, by the way, that monitored $376 billion of dodgy cartel cash. It's a lot of money going through your bank from people who sometimes do business with chainsaws and a pair of pliers. HSBC let $670 billion of cartel cash go through its systems without being monitored. The cartels even had special boxes made where they could dump huge amounts of cash right at the teller windows at HSBC outlets in Mexico. It ended up paying $1.256 billion in forfeiture, as well as another $665 million. Where exactly all that money goes depends on various factors, but it usually just goes back to law enforcement, we guess, so they can carry on fighting the war on drugs. Sisyphus gets some new shoes, and he needs them. The war on drugs cost the U.S. $51 billion per year and has cost well over $1 trillion over 50 years, although most of that money comes from the taxpayer. Anyway, you can't really beat having banks handle your cash and not ask questions. It's akin to the cops helping you get away with murder. And the best thing is, if you're a banker, you're too big to go to jail. A former federal agent said it really bursts people's bubbles who think money laundering is always super complex. It sometimes isn't. That guy said in an interview, it's so simple, it's so unsophisticated. That is what to me is the most disturbing part of this. These guys are not even trying that hard. Take, for example, of the drug cartel that goes by the name of Los Zetas. They had a scheme in which they bought racing horses and used the profits to launder through the Bank of America. In this case, a U.S. man connected to the gang did the banking. It was small change though, amounting to only $1.5 million. Also in this case, the bank wasn't to blame, so no fines were handed out. The thing with banks is they can say that they didn't know what was going on, but sometimes they really don't. That's why cartels will look for weak spots, meaning banks in some countries that don't have the highest grade mechanisms in place to spot suspicious movements of money. It goes without saying that the cartels are still doing it today. Sometimes they do what rich folks do who make their money legally, that is, store the money offshore where it can't be taxed. Regular companies do this by exploiting loopholes in the law, with royalty, big business, celebrities, and politicians getting in on the act. A modern example of this is in the case of a Mexican boss named Rafael Caro Quintero, whose incredibly expensive mansion was bought through an offshore account. By using such ghost accounts, the cartels can layer the money through many transactions. Some Chinese businessmen are in on the deal too, due to it being a vast country with massive and intricate industries. The US media reports that China is actually the go-to place these days for cartels, where money laundering is said to be a complex issue. It was reported in one recent case that a large network of Chinese nationals were taking the drug money from the cartels by picking up large sums of it, often in the US. Then laundering was trade-based laundering that we talked about earlier, where the buying of goods is the name of the game. Just make it look like you're buying big from a business in China, and that company will do a bit of what's called trade misinvoicing, and everyone's a winner. Not long ago, a Chinese national was arrested in the US for doing something called a mirror swap with the cartels. In this case, the broker took the drug money and then transferred that same amount of Chinese currency in their Chinese bank to a Chinese launderer. Money got swapped. And how did the US authorities track Chinese money? Not easily. The Chinese person who was caught in the act was under surveillance, with the FBI hearing tapped telephone calls of the guy saying he was really worried about getting ripped off or even killed. He was handed $3 million over some time, which he had to send to someone else in China. He took a 3% commission. He probably shouldn't have worried about being killed, since a good money launderer is a hot property. Some of the stranger ways to launder your cash is something you might have already thought about when you imagined becoming a criminal. What if you simply opened an account with an online gambling platform? That way you could keep the cash there and get it out using a variety of payment methods. You could also take the risk of gambling, but only bet on safer kinds of bets, such as what people sometimes call sure winners. Criminals have often used casinos in a similar way. Again, it's very basic. You go into a casino, you buy a large number of chips, then you play a bit and cash them in. This has been happening at casinos for years. As you have a receipt from the casino, it looks like you have clean money. Just in 2021, the media reported that a Chinese gang of launderers have been busted for cleaning millions of drug money for the cartels. They did some trade laundering, but they also sent money to a Chinese businessman who'd opened his own casino in Guatemala City. You can be sure having a casino working with you is an excellent way to get rid of your cash. In fact, many of the most recent reports feature Chinese nationals using casinos and also cryptocurrency to help the cartels clean their hard-earned blood money. When you purchase crypto, you do so with an identifying number, but you don't have to give your full name. Even though the blockchain where the transaction is recorded is there for the authorities to see, it's hard for them to track back the cash to a cartel. The criminals could have lots of accounts with different kinds of currencies, and they also use Smurfs in the virtual world to handle their money. It's thought that the cartels have used cryptocurrencies to buy certain chemicals needed to make synthetic drugs made by Chinese companies. The word on the street is the cartels have moved around $3 billion through Chinese crypto exchanges, accounting for 50% of the crypto money they have. That analysis was from 2019, but you can be sure that this new way of laundering has taken off a lot more since then. The drug trade likely seems even more enticing than it did in the past, so we very much doubt that Sisyphus is going to retire anytime soon. As things stand, his sentence is still eternity. Now you need to watch Cocaine versus Heroin. Which drug is more dangerous? Drug addiction.